Hi, my name is Hope With, and I'll be sharing today about the Old Testament survey. Now, there's a couple things I'd like to share regarding this presentation, and here's my overview of things I hope to answer during this. The first being, what is the Pentateuch? What is the overview of the Old Testament? Third, authorship of the Pentateuch. And lastly, what are the different sections of the Old Testament all about? Now, the books of the Old Testament are a rich and diverse collection of literature that reflect the history, culture, and faith of the Jewish people. While they can be read in any manner, the book of the Bible in the order that they were written in can be a good experience. They offer insights into the nature of God, the meaning of life, and the human condition. Whether we read them for spiritual guidance, academic study, or personal inspiration, the books of the Old Testament continue to speak to us today, inviting us to explore the depths of our own faith and the mysteries of God's love and grace. The Old Testament is divided into five main sections that you'll hear me talk about today. These six things are the books of the law, books of historical value, wisdom books, the major and minor prophets, and poetry books. Now let's look at the law of the Pentateuch. The term Pentateuch, meaning five volumes or five scrolls, refers to the first five books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Another word for the collection of books is Torah, which also means instruction, teaching, or doctrine. This collection is also called the Book of the Law. The five books together present a history of humanity from creation to the death of Moses, with particular reference to the development of the Hebrew people. Now, the Pentateuch also gives special attention to the activity of God, God's nature, and his purpose for mankind. Let's take a look here into the authorship of the Pentateuch. Now, the authorship of the Pentateuch was challenged, especially in conservative circles. Some hold the view that some or even many participated in the authorship of the first five books of the Old Testament. That is until modern times, all Christians and Jews believe that Moses was the author of most or even all of the Pentateuch. Now, certain critics have denied the Mosaic authorship of Deuteronomy, in particular for three principal reasons. The first being the difference in style from preceding books. Secondly, they say that the laws of Deuteronomy differ in certain parts from those of the first four books of the Pentateuch. And lastly, the third point, he did not write the account of his death. Now, there are two schools of thought on the authorship of the Pentateuch. The first is the traditional source, while the second is the organizational source. The first source is based on the popular tradition that Moses wrote the books that comprise the Pentateuch, while the second source differs greatly from the first. According to the protagonists of this view, the authorship of the Pentateuch is to be deduced from the language, the style employed, and the arrangement of the text. According to this source, Moses wrote part of the Pentateuch while the other authors wrote the rest. Now let's take a look into the historical books. The historical books are the first 12 books of Joshua through Esther, and they are called again the historical books. Now, this is because they contain the details of the historical events relating to Israel from the conquest of Canaan through the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities back to the return and restoration to Palestine under Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, these books span the rest of the biblical material historically through the ministry of Malachi, embracing a period of almost 1,000 years. Next, we have what I like to call the wisdom and poetic books. Now, these biblical wisdom books don't rely ultimately on human wisdom or observation. Instead, they're grounded in the wisdom of God. Behind all of the perplexities and uncertainties of life, these writings recognize the hand of a sovereign creator who is all wise and all powerful, a God not of chaos, but of order. These are also sharp contrasts between the wisdom literature of the Bible and the rest of the Old Testament. You see, these books speak in a more indirect style than the Old Testament historical narratives that precede them and the prophetical oracles that follow. In terms of content, they make observations about the created order and how to live well, and they reflect on the problem of suffering and the meaning of life. But in all of this, they draw attention to the wisdom and the power of God. For the most part, the Old Testament wisdom books don't offer easy answers or simple conclusions to the large questions that they tackle. As several of the Psalms and Proverbs attest, they deal in dark sayings, riddles, and mysteries, words of the wise preserved from ancient times for future generations. They invite readers to think deeply and to trust and worship God despite life's challenges and ambiguities. Next, we have the Minor Prophets. The Minor Prophets is a collection of 12 Old Testament books known as the 12 or the Book of the 12 in the Hebrew Bible. The title minor refers to length, not significance. The minor prophets each had their own unique message to their particular audience. The span in which they prophesied was from the 800s to the 400s. Their prophetic ministries covered both the Assyrian invasion, the destruction of the northern kingdom, the Babylonian exile, as well as the years after the return from exile. It should be noted that the 12 are not in chronological order, in that there seems to be some variance in order with which the prophets appear throughout the years. And then lastly, I'd like to touch a little bit here on the major prophets. As we know, the major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Their writings comprise 5 books of the Bible in the Old Testament: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Because their prophetic writings can be hard to interpret at times, some people consider books written by the prophets, both major and minor, as the least desirable to read. The writings of the prophets discuss how important it is for Christian people to change their ways to avoid God's wrath, shining more light on carnal intentions of our people.